we have really a fabulous panel, myself being excluded. I've worked with both of these gentlemen for a long time now, actually. Mark Jornstad is the superintendent of the Saddle Mountain Unified School District. He's very well respected in his field. I think you're president of the superintendent's division of the Arizona School Administrators Association. And I first met Mark when he took over what at the time was a very troubled school district in Saddle Mountain. Saddle Mountain was actually placed in receivership for financial mismanagement issues that are related to what we're going to talk about today. And Mark was the individual that came in, took the reins, put that district back on the right track, and that district has done very well under his leadership. And Mark's here today to give us some perspective on really the operational realities with respect to the budget cuts and what schools are experiencing around the state in that particular front. So Mark, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Chuck Essigs. Chuck is the guru of school finance in the state of Arizona. If you have a question about school finance, no matter who you are or what organization you represent, you go to Chuck, and I'm very thrilled that Chuck still takes my calls, because I've called him a number of times over the years just to put into simple terms a very complex system. Chuck has been the CFO of a large school district, the Mesa School District. He's headed up school finance for the Department of Education. He is currently with the Arizona School Boards, or Arizona School Business Officials, and is really a fixture down at the Capitol and someone that is respected on both sides of the aisle. And is going to begin our program today by talking, or giving us an overview of really what happened in the most recent budget cycle with respect to K-12 school finance. And so with that, Chuck, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Vince. I really appreciate you having me here. The topic of school finance doesn't make you really popular as a speaker with a lot of groups or whatever, so I don't get invited out very often, so I really appreciate the opportunity. As I'll go through this, if Vince or someone, when I get close to 1:45, let me know if I'm still talking. During the presentation, feel free to stop and ask any questions for clarification, or if you want to comment or whatever, because I think we have time to do that. As the beginning part of this, we're going to talk about what happened in the legislative session in terms of school funding issues, and then we're going to share a little bit of information with you about where Arizona ranks nationally with some of the latest numbers that just came out on Monday of this week. The funding formula we have a funding formula. It's on a per pupil basis, and the legislature starts out with what's called a base level, and this is what schools start out, and then you have weights, and you multiply that base level by different weights depending on the academic and special ed needs of the students. And when the legislature gives schools an inflation increase, that's what they increase the base, and that increases everything in the funding formula that gets multiplied by that. Just a little history. The voters of this state in November of 2000, when a proposal that Governor Hall and the legislature put out was called Proposition 301, and one of the components of Proposition 301 was that the legislature had to increase this base level and this part of the formula every year for inflation, because schools had lost during the 90s quite a bit of ground to inflation. And you might have read in the paper about a lawsuit that's been going on because the legislature, starting in 2009, stopped funding inflation the way the schools thought it should be funded, and tried some different approaches. That went to court, and the Supreme Court and the Appeals Court have all ruled in favor of the school districts that they did not fund that properly. The legislature for the last few years has started funding inflation, but the big issue is, are they ever going to make up the money that districts lost during that 3 or 4 year period of time that they didn't fund it accurately, and that's still being handled by the courts. But basically, inflation was 1.59%. The legislature increased the base level by that amount. And then one other thing that they put in their budget at the request of Governor Ducey, they put an extra $54 per pupil, per weighted pupil in the formula. That was about a 1.6% increase the way it worked out. But it was not part of the, it's because of the lawsuit, in the legislation that this is not part of the base level, so it's not part of the official funding for schools, because it's still being adjusted in the courts as to how that's going to, is that actually going to apply in future years? Would the legislature have to continue to adjust that for inflation? So it gets pretty complicated, but the legislature did fund basic inflation, and the governor basically referred to this as a down payment on the lawsuit. The lawsuit's about to bring districts back up to where they should be. The legislature would have to put in an additional $330 million, according to the order from the court. This ended up being about $74 million, so it would cover a portion of that if there was ever any agreement that could be put together. Transportation, that's what school districts get to run their buses to and from school, to transport regular ed kids and disabled kids back and forth to school. Under Prop 301, that also is required to get an inflation increase, and the legislature has funded that every year. But you can see a slight increase in the amount per mile to adjust for inflation. Charter and school districts, in the first part of the formula, not the transportation formula, but the base part of the formula and the weighted formula, for charters and school districts, it's the same formula. Districts get transportation funding. Charters don't get transportation funding, but they get what's called additional assistance. And that gives them money for transportation, that gives them capital money, and monies for their facilities and equipment. And that has always gotten an inflation increase. And you can see the slight increase, and that brings the elementary amount up to $1,700 per pupil, and the high school amount per pupil up to just over $2,000. Districts get what's called district additional assistance, and that is mainly for capital funding for the school districts. And that's been cut very heavily during the last couple of years. For the upcoming year, that total reduction to district additional assistance is just over $352 million. What it means is except for districts that have 1,100 or less students, because the state, because of wanting to help small districts, capped what their cut could be. So when the state implements this cut, they can't cut districts with 1,100 students or less more than $5 million in total. But the rest of the districts in the state, after that $352 million cut, they're only going to get about 85%. Their cut's going to be about 85% of their capital funding. So schools for capital funding are really hurting. They're hurting in operational funding, as I'll show you later, but in capital funding, because of the cuts that keep added each year, it's pretty severe. And Mark might talk a little bit about what that meant to his district, but it's gotten very, very severe, and districts have very little capital money left after the cuts are put in place. Charter additional assistance, that's what we talked about for charter transportation and capital for charters. That has a reduction of $15 million in place for this year. The legislature added a $3 million cut to that, so their cut is going to be $18 million. Which is about $106, or about 4.7% per student in what's called their charter additional assistance. The calculation of how it works for districts, we talked about for districts that have 1,100 or less students, the cut can't be more than $5 million statewide. For those districts, the estimate is that their cut will be about 70%. So even those smaller districts are going to feel a lot of pain, but it's not quite as much as the other districts. And when the legislature does these reductions, it's important. There are some districts that don't get any state aid because they have such, their property wealth, taxable property wealth is high enough where the legislative formula has them fund 100% of their program. Even those districts, the cut applies to them. So even a district that doesn't get any state aid, they're still going to have their cut in what they can budget for district additional assistance. Calculation for charters, it's a little bit different because they don't have the 1,100 difference in things. And charters, all of their funding comes from the state, except for federal money or gifts and donations they get. So for charters, the cut will be on a proportional basis for each charter school to get that 4.7% reduction in place. Joint Technological Education Districts, or JTEDs, I don't know how many of you might be familiar with, probably the one that you might be most familiar with is the East Valley Institute of Technology in Mesa. There are now JTEDs in pretty much all the counties. Yuma just started one that will open up next year. And what they do is they work with the school districts that are part of their attendance area, and they provide vocational programs for students. And what most students do is they get part of their program in the regular school district, their academic classes, and they get their vocational classes at the JTED, or the JTED offers satellite classes. It's been a very successful program and been very, I think, beneficial, especially to a lot of businesses in the state. I know the auto dealers provide a lot of vocal support and some financial support to the JTEDs, because one of their programs is to train auto mechanics. But they've become very popular and are very needed. And Eve, it's the oldest one. It's been around for the longest period of time. Now we get a lot of questions when I do presentations, because there's questions about who gets more money out of the state funding formula. Do charters get more money, or do districts get more money? And the best way to say is they're both right. It depends on what they're arguing. And the first part of it is, and the legislature hasn't updated this for over a year and a half, but hopefully they'll update it pretty soon. But when you look at district schools, the different parts of the funding we talked about, capital outlay and soft capital have now been combined into district additional assistance. But the state funding is about just over $5,000 for a student. For a charter school, it's just over $6,100. So the state funding is actually higher for charter schools than it is for districts. And that's what districts say. Charters get more money than we do. The legislature, for many years, we would tell them that, and they didn't believe us. They said, no, you're wrong. And the charter school people would say we're wrong. And then what happened is a couple of districts figured it out. The Cave Creek School District, which was one of the ones that Dr. Burdick would have been here today, except for an emergency. The districts figured out if they charter their schools, they'll get more money than they get through the regular funding formula. And in fiscal year 2014, there were, I believe, 65 schools in the state that decided to do that. Paradise Valley District was one of the leaders, and they've chartered 19 of their schools. That cost.
So they're not creating new schools.
They're not creating new schools.
Existing schools to charters.
They're taking one of their schools and saying, now this school is a district-sponsored charter school, because the law allowed districts to sponsor charter schools. That cost the state an extra $24 million. And then when the budget people at the state figured out that probably most all the schools in the state are going to do this to get that extra money, it was going to be hundreds of millions of dollars. So the legislature stopped that. And right now, all the charter schools that are in operation are ending. No more, none of them can continue, except a couple of districts had charters for multiple years before this happened, and they're going to get a little extra money for one more year. But in fiscal year 17, after next year, there'll be no district-sponsored charter schools left. But that did prove that charters do get more. Now the charters look at, if you take all the money that districts have, take all their federal money, take their bonds, and take their overrides, and take the monies they get from gate receipts and everything, districts actually do get more money. They get about $9,000 on average, and charter schools get $7,400. Federal is a big part of that. District schools tend to get significantly more federal money per pupil than do charters, for a couple of reasons. Some charters don't want to apply, or another big reason is most school districts have a food service program where they have free and reduced lunch for children who meet certain poverty levels. Most charters don't have a food service program. A lot of the federal programs for special education, and then there are some local monies in there. So if a charter school tells you that districts get more, they're right. If they're talking about all the revenue that's out there, if you just look at what the state funding provides, charters do get more than districts.
May I ask a quick question?
Sure.
About so when you say they stopped doing that, as far as, was that allowing were they not approving the charters for district-sponsored charter schools anymore? Or did they say, like, there's no such thing as
They
district?
changed the law and said you can't do it anymore.
Okay, so they
So-
said districts can no longer sponsor charter schools?
No more, no new districts could sponsor district-sponsored charter schools. The ones who had them
Okay,
only for 1 year, they're done after this year. And the ones who had them for multiple years, they get another half funding for another year and they're gone, so.
Thank
Then
you.
the state basically couldn't, it was pretty much a fiscal decision. They just couldn't afford all of that money that would cost to do that. District-sponsored charter schools, that's what we just talked about, a timely question. They deleted the statutory reference to allow that. They did permit some of the school districts that had been around for a number of years to get partial funding in up till June 30th of 2016. And they did, and the last thing there, that stopped the districts who had charters. There were only a handful of them in the state prior to 2014. They had a law where they could continue when the other ones got dissolved, but they changed the law and said they're gone too. Now, spending reductions, and I think when you look at this last legislative session, the Joint Legislative Budget Committee did a very nice report, and they took about all the new funding that districts got, and they subtracted out all the funding that districts were losing through all the cuts to charter schools and everything else. It maxed out at about a $21 million reduction, which not very good, but that's a lot better than the last few years. And there is some dispute that when you talk to legislators, some of them will say, well, you can't count cuts that were made in other years and are just taking effect now. Because some of them will say, we actually gave more money. But basically, it's about a break-even year for traditional school districts. But if you actually add up all the adds and all the subtraction, schools were down by about $24 million. And these are the things that were repealed. Governor Brewer, one of the highlights of her program, and one of the programs that she really pushed was called the Student Success Funding Formula. And it was a $21 million appropriation that district got funded this year. This is the first year, but it'll be the only year. And the idea was they had a formula and they looked at each district in terms of how students grew and what kind of growth they made and what kind of progress they made. And the more growth and progress you made, the more money you got per pupil. Wasn't very much, but it was a start, but the legislature did repeal that. They eliminated the district-sponsored charter schools that we were talking about, so that's about a $24 million cut. They eliminated the district schools that started before 2014, cut their funding in half, that's $2.4 million. Career Ladder, which is a program that was around for many years. So you can see when you added up all the cuts, it's about a $109 million reduction to school districts around the state. And then for district additional assistance, there's a $350 million cut. So schools are actually getting hit with a $461 million reduction from what they should be having if the formulas were fully funded. It's been a tough time. In defense of the legislature, over the last few years, Arizona probably got hit harder than most other states in terms of the economic downturn. The states had a real revenue problem and a real issue, but schools have felt the cuts, and it's really hit a lot of school districts pretty hard. The Apache Junction School District, for example, is a fairly good, large-sized district. They're going to go on a 4-day school week next year. There are about, I believe, 50 school districts in the state that are doing 4-day school weeks. Most of them are real small rural communities where it made sense because of transportation and everything to have a 4-day school. Apache Junction is the first district that I'm aware of any size that went to it because they just couldn't afford to do it any other way. But it does show the problems that schools were facing. The legislature also put some extra money in the budget because of $22.5 million, because what their formula normally is, we put extra money in there per student, but then there are a couple of reasons why they had to put more money in beyond that is we're having more and more students move to charter schools. And since charter schools get a higher level of funding, and since charter schools are funded 100% by the state, it costs the state more for each one of those students, and that's an extra $12 million. And we're getting, in special education, the percentage of students in special education in Arizona is increasing. We're getting more special ed kids, disabled students, as a proportion of the total school population. They get extra funding, and the legislature had to put another $10 million in to cover that. And it's interesting on charters and school districts. You can see in districts up above, in 2009, 8.6% of their population was disabled. Learning disabled, speech handicapped students are your two largest populations, but that would include visually, hearing impaired, emotionally handicapped, disabled students. For 2013, the estimate from the JLBC is that's about a 10.5% increase. So schools are getting a larger percentage of their populations needing special ed services. For charters, they're also seeing some increase, but not nearly as high. They had 3.2% of their population in 2009, and 2013 their population was 4.6. A couple of reasons why districts have more disabled students. One is they have programs in place, especially for your more severely disabled students, so parents tend to go to those schools for services, especially hearing, vision impaired, things of that nature. And the other thing is, if you see any ads in the paper for charter schools, they're not advertising for disabled students, they're advertising for non-disabled students. So that's one of the reasons why you'll see, well, I think we'll continue to see for quite a while, a higher percentage in districts than there are in charters. School Facilities Board, as bad as the funding for schools is on their day-to-day operations, capital is even more difficult for schools, which we talked about earlier. But some things that the legislature did change this year is, one, it requires SFB, and that's the School Facilities Board, to annually publish a list of vacant and unused district buildings. Some charters want to try and use unused space, but the legislature thought it would be good for people to know how many unused and vacant schools are out there. Requires districts to report their bonds. Class B bonds are the only bonds, the regular school bonds, but which ones they get approved so they could have a complete list. Requires the School Facilities Board to annually report all district Class B bonds approvals, and then requires the School Facilities Board to refinance or refund. During the time when state budgets were really hurting, and before that, any new schools that the state had to build for schools, they didn't have the money to buy with cash, so they leased purchased them. So there's a number of schools that were built in districts that are on a lease purchase. Since interest rates have dropped, they're telling the School Facilities Board, just as you do with refinancing your mortgage, to go out and refinance those lease purchase agreements, and there's some pretty good savings to have. One of the things that the Governor Ducey did pass, you might have read about it in the paper, it's called our Best Public Schools Fund, and it's none of the details have come out on how this gets administered, but there was $23.9 million that's been put in a fund to help public schools, which would be districts and charters, who become part of an Arizona Public School Achievement District, which what that is has not been released yet. And it does require 50% of this money to be used in low socioeconomic areas. This was part of when the governor was saying he wanted to expand capacity in the high-performing schools in the state that already had waiting lists. This is part of that program, but none of the details have been released on how that's actually going to work. One thing and this doesn't affect, surprisingly, what schools spend. It does affect their revenue, and it is something the state is going to have to address down the road. What happened when the economic times were really bad, what the state did, and they didn't do this, schools would have had bigger cuts. But if you go to June 30th, and any money you pay the schools before June 30th count against the budget for that year. if you make any payments that the district earned in that year, but you make it after July 1, it's in the next fiscal year, so it counts against the next fiscal year budget. It's called a rollover. Doesn't save them any money, but it gets the money out of one budget and puts it into the next budget. But when you do that, then the next year you got to roll over again, or you have to come up with that extra money. The state did that for a number of years. The last couple of years they haven't increased it, but that's up to almost $1 billion. So about $1 billion that the state owes schools, they're paying in the next fiscal year. And like I said, the alternative would have been to have even bigger cuts to schools. But at some point, the state needs to address this for two reasons. One is we just need to get back to a fiscally sound budget. But secondly, if we run into bad economic times again, they're not going to have this option because they've kind of hit about all that they can do. The rating agencies that rate schools on their bonds and everything are kind of saying, hey, that's about it. You shouldn't be rolling over any more than $1 billion. So that's...
Can you give us a sense of how big that is in the scale as compared to the entire state?
Well,
budget?
the state budget for schools is probably maybe $3.5–4 billion. So it's a large 25–30% of the total. The state has done this many times before, but never to this extent. And they're not going to address this for a couple of years, I don't think, until their budget starts recovering. But they do have to address it. But I want to stress it doesn't require schools to spend less. It just hits them on their cash flow. But they can still spend everything that is in their budget. They just have to make sure they have enough cash to cover all the bills when they come in. And some of the bills they don't pay until July for things that they did in June. They put a cap on the 1% limit. We talked about that earlier. There's a provision in the Constitution that's been in place since 1980 that a homeowner in the state of Arizona cannot pay more than 1% primary property taxes of the value of their home. And it's been around for many years, and the legislature is costing the legislator quite a bit of money. So they changed this formula, and they gave each county $1 million. Now, the rationale there is kind of interesting, because why would you give Maricopa and Pima County $1 million and give $1 million to La Paz County unless you wanted something to happen? And what's going to happen is that $1 million doesn't cover the cost to keep all those homes below 1%. And nobody knows what's going to happen because the counties and the cities and the school districts are struggling with what's going to happen now. The legislature doesn't provide this money. Do we have to cut our spending? And but it is a provision, and obviously nobody in a logic way would put $1 million in each county. But what happens with this is Maricopa, Pima, and Pinal County get hit the hardest because they have more of that. Pima and Pinal County get hit by far the hardest because of how their taxing structure works. Other major revenue sources that school districts get, the Classroom Site Fund, and that's Prop 301, and I'll just spend a brief time talking about that. That was Governor Hull's initiative that she put together in 2000 that the voters voted on and passed, and basically that's the one that had the inflation adjustment in it. It also increased the sales tax in the state by 0.6 cents. And the money from that 0.6 cents goes into a fund that gets distributed. Some of it goes to universities, some of it goes to community colleges, some of it goes to the Department of Ed, but the majority of it goes to school districts, and school districts are limited mostly to using this money for teachers. That's gone up and down over the years, depending on how the economy's been done, but that's going to be the estimate for next year is $327 per weighted pupil. And then they do get the instructional gaming, and that when Indian gaming was put into Arizona in the early 80s, Jaime Malera was the superintendent of public instruction during that time, and the casinos and the Indian reservations came to him and said, we want to do something that the voters would like, because we want to make sure that everybody votes to have casinos and have to have gambling. And he said, well, the best thing is put a little of that money into education. So it's not a lot, but it's $40 per student, comes from the Indian gaming monies that goes into school districts. And the new student success formula, that was a different additional source, but as we talked about earlier, that's eliminated for the 2015-16 school year. Classroom site fund has gone anywhere from $120 to $401, depending on how the economy's doing, because it's money coming from a 6/10 increase in the sales tax. So the more people buy, the more money is raised. The less people buy, the less money is raised.
Chuck, before you move on,
Yes.
can you talk about 301, Prop 301, and what happens after 2020?
Okay. Prop 301 was in place for 20 years, and then it disappears. It's no longer a law, so, and I believe it's if fiscal year 21, it ends up, because, what will happen at that time, the 0.6 cent increase in the sales tax goes away, because that was only in place for 20 years. The inflation adjustment to schools stays, because that did not have a 20-year timeline on it. But the big thing is districts will lose if it doesn't get reapproved. First, if it doesn't go back out to the voters, then it's gone. But if it goes back out to the voters and they don't reapprove it, all that money we've been talking about would disappear because the tax would no longer be allowed. And there's some talk about doing that earlier, not waiting until the end. There's some, but no one right now in fiscal year 21, which would be the 2021 school year, is the last year that sales tax money would be available to school districts. Yes.
Is there a provision that it automatically goes
No.
back to the voters, or
It's
the
20
voters
years.
or the
20 years it
legislature?
expires, and it would have to go.
So
The
we have to
legislature
put
put that on the ballot with Governor Hull's leadership. And I don't know how many of you knew Governor Hull. She was a very convincing person. If she wanted some of you to do something, she would make sure that you understood how important it was to her that you did what she wanted to do. And she got the legislature to do that. And it was a good program, and it's a good thing for schools. But part of it was, and I think part of it was to help get it passed, because basically the issue was 20 years, and then we'll see how it's working. If it's working, we can reapprove it. But it would have to go back out either by citizens' initiative, getting enough signatures, or the legislature putting it back on the ballot.
Governor Hull was a teacher.
Yeah, she was. She was a very, and education, she did, this is one of the big, Prop 301 is one of the biggest funding increases for education beyond what would be the normal amounts or whatever. But she was I liked her, but boy, you knew when you didn't do what she wanted you to do, you got the message. Yes?
Do you feel like either the citizens initiative or the sponsorship of a legislator is particularly likely? I mean, is Prop 301 a safe bet, or?
I think it would be likely that it would happen again because of the kind of money. I think there'll be some people who want to change it, and some people want to go to a full cent rather than 0.6 cent, which the governor obviously said would oppose, at least in his current statements. Or they may want the money to be distributed a little bit differently. And what's interesting, when it passed in 1980, it failed in most all counties. It passed in Maricopa and Pima County, and they carried the rest of the state. The rest of the state voted against it, and no one knows exactly why. But it was 53% voted for it. But in most counties it failed, except in Maricopa and Pima obviously carried it. So other local funding sources, districts can have overrides. They can extend their budget capacity up to an extra 15% if the voters approve it. They have to be, they're only good for 5 years. And then after 5 years, if you don't get your override reapproved, it phases out over 2 years. It's been very difficult the last few years for districts to pass overrides when you have bad economic times. And the best example is, and best example is the Dysart School District, which I think they're laying off well over 100 teachers because they lost their override, which funded a full-day kindergarten program. And Scottsdale had their override fail twice. They just passed it this last time, and they're hiring back 150 teachers or whatever because they had to get rid of them when they lost. So districts with that extra money generally use it to increase programs, hire more teachers or different services for the district, and if you lose it, whatever you added, almost you have to just take that away or something else because you have to adjust back relatively quickly. Bonds are where districts want to build or remodel or buy their facilities or whatever. Again, that requires voter approval. The limit on bonding is a percentage of your property value, so a district like Scottsdale that has higher property values has more bonding capacity, but it varies from district to district. Again, that requires voter approval. Federal funds are major sources of funding for many districts. The biggest federal programs are Chapter 1 for disadvantaged students. There's a fairly big program for disabled students, and food services. There's a lot of money coming into the state to help free and reduced lunch programs, and grants and donations. And whatever district receives in a grant or whatever they receive in a donation, they can expend that money. It's not subject to their budget limit. It's limited to whatever money they have, and basically the terms of the grant and how much the grant is for. Now, changes in per pupil funding, and this just came out. I think I sent the one with fiscal year 13, but it's not going to change that much. But basically, in 1992, if you look at federal funding, the U.S. average was $361 per pupil. Arizona was $453 per pupil. So we ranked 6th. And was 125% of the national average. For fiscal year 12, the U.S. average was $1,126. The Arizona was $1,251, and we rank 17th. So these are that should be fiscal year 13. I didn't get that correct when I just updated it yesterday. So we're 111%. So federal funding, our schools do pretty well compared to the rest of the nation. State sources, in 1992, we were $2,600 at the national average. Arizona was $2,086. We ranked 39th, and we were at 78% of the U.S. average. For fiscal year 13 and fiscal year 12, the numbers changed a little bit, but we were fiscal year 13, we were $5,650 at the U.S. average, $3,116 at Arizona, we were 50th. We moved, starting in 2012 and 2013, we have less money per pupil going to Arizona schools than any other state. And the other issue with it is, it's only at 55% of the U.S. average. So you can see the difference between what other states would get and what Arizona used to get. Local sources, we were ranked 26th in 1992, and now we're at 30, and we're at 75%. So what this says is that Arizona, and then when you look overall, Arizona's dropped to 48th. So only 2 other states, Idaho and Utah, spend less per pupil than Arizona, have revenue per pupil less than Arizona, and we're almost 70%. Probably a little under 70% of the U.S. average. But you see what's happening to us is the state, if we could get the state funding, and the issue with getting more state funding is where does the revenue come from? And I understand that's what the legislature will say, and that's certainly a legitimate argument. But you can see what the changes in federal or changes in state funding have done to what school districts have available to them. And we've dropped every year in our rankings until we hit 50. The change in rankings in 1991-92, Arizona ranked 34th, above 16 other states. In 2012, or fiscal year 13, we ranked 48th, as we just talked about. To move back to 87.7%, that's where we were as a percentage of the U.S. average overall. In 20 years ago, we'd have to increase spending by about $2,258. Round numbers, that's about $2.2 billion, because there's about 1 million kids in the state. So we'll probably never be at the national average. We'll probably never get back to 87% unless there was a lot more money available in future years. In 91-92, these were the states that we were ahead of, and you can see now we're only ahead of Idaho and Utah. This is what I think is interesting. This is basically state funding, just looking at state funding. And in 91-92, we ranked 41st, We were 43, 41, 42. You see, we stayed in the 40s. 2001, 2002, we dropped down to 45. We were pretty much in the 40s and pretty much at about 70%, somewhere in the 70% for U.S., as a percentage of the U.S. average. In 2013, as we started to move down, we went 45, we stayed in the 40s until 2009, 2010, and then we went 48, 49, 50, and 50. And you can also see in the percentages, we went from the 70s to the 60s and very quickly dropped into the 50s. So Arizona public schools have it very difficult in my mind, and you probably hear from the superintendent who's had to manage it, and we've moved a lot in a direction that I'm not sure it's where we wanted the state to go. But in defense of the legislature, they will tell you they put 41% of the general fund into schools, which is a pretty good percentage. But you can see what's happened to the funding for schools over that period of time. And to kind of summarize, Arizona in fiscal year 2013, now this is all revenue. This is state revenue, federal revenue, and local revenue. We're at $8,599. We're 69.5% of the U.S. average. Arizona moved from being at 87% to under 70% in fiscal year 13. Our rank has dropped, and funding per pupil is at lower than, state funding per pupil is lower than any other state, quite a bit below. We're $2,500 below the national average. And I think that's my time, and I'll be glad to try and answer any questions. Yes. Going back and then right there.
So Chuck, I've seen some comparisons that actually do like cost of living adjustments. You know, Arizona's a less expensive state and all that stuff. So have you seen those, and what do you think of that analysis? Because it does shift some of the stuff around. We don't see quite as extreme in some of those cases. What do you think of that?
Education Week in January of each year does a ranking of the states, and they adjust for cost of living, and we're still 48th.
Right, but there seem to be, but it's more tightly grouped. There's a lot of states.
Some states move a little bit,
around.
but Arizona still stays near the bottom. At least the last report that came out from Education Week. Now, if you look at what the legislature, in fact, the School Boards Association, we worked together and they just put something out. If you go back to 2008 and go to 2014, which was the last time the legislature had done that report, Arizona adjusted for inflation, state funding adjusted for inflation went down 24%. It stayed about the same, but because of inflation, so we've lost a lot of ground. That was the reason for Prop 301. During the 90s, we lost, where schools had some difficult times because there was a feeling among some people that schools didn't need inflation. And what always happens, in my opinion, is that in bad economic times, schools get hit because we're a big part of the state budget. And there's probably no way for the legislature not to do that. The problem is when it recovers, they don't go back and make up for the money that schools lost during that period of time. And that's what drags us down, is during good times they find legitimate other uses for the money, but they don't make it up to schools. They say, well, we're funding if you only fund schools at the rate of inflation during good times and you cut them in bad times, you're going to lose ground to inflation over time. Yes.
I know that all the issues around the funding that comes from state trust land are very complex, but can you give just a snapshot of what percentage of the current funding from the state is coming out of the state trust land mechanism?
Okay. The state trust lands, and if we have a few minutes, because I could talk about
Sure.
the ties that the governor that's going to have Governor Ducey's going to have a press conference pretty soon. That's one of the proposals that he's putting together. Right now, any money that goes from the sale of state lands goes into a permanent trust, and the earnings off of that trust can be distributed, but the corpus or the principal part of that should not be distributed. legislature, and it was Governor Ducey's, Treasurer Ducey's proposal, is to take 2.5% of that money in that permanent trust and put it into the classroom site fund, and that's where that goes now. But the first $72 million of earnings on state trust lands from leasing or earnings off of goes to the legislature, and they use that to offset what they have to do to fund schools. So the first $72 million. The 2.5%, I think the last year it raised about 80, for this year about $82 million or whatever. In a couple of years it'll go up to about $100 million. In fiscal year 17, they project it'll be $100 million, that 2.5% that goes in the classroom site fund. There's $5 billion in there, and it's grown from maybe around $3 billion 5 years ago to $5 billion now, for a couple of reasons. One is they've sold land even during the bad times, or people were paying off some of the state land department financed a lot of the land that they sold. And it's kind of interesting, when the economy went bad, they got a lot of the land back. So it wasn't a bad deal. They got a big down payment, and then the developers couldn't afford to make their payments, so they got the land back. They never did lose the land. Other land, people paid cash for it. But what Governor Ducey's going to propose this afternoon at 1:30 is you raise the 2.5%. Let's say in fiscal year 2017, because this will need voter approval and everything, so it's down the road. Raise that to 10%. So if 2.5% raises $100 million, you're increasing it by 7.5%, so that's about another $300 million. And he would do that for 5 years. But then for 5 years, it drops from 7.5% of new money down to 2.5% of new money. So it's about a 2/3 drop. So what's being proposed, and obviously people will look at it, and we haven't gotten all the details or all the information off of it, and that may make it a little bit different. That's how it was explained to us yesterday. So for 5 years, it's going to really help schools. After 5 years, it's going to be difficult, because they're going to have whatever they added during that 5-year period of time, unless the economy really recovers and there's other sources of money, there's going to be a very big loss of money to hundreds of millions of dollars cut to schools.
Which coincides also with 301 expiring.
And 301 expires in 5 years. So the schools would be facing, if this doesn't start until fiscal year 2017, because it needs voter approval. The next time we have a general election in this state would be November of 2016, unless they have a special election. And I don't know if they'd have a special election just for this, or some people like special elections, some people don't like special elections. And it's going to take approval by the legislature, and then the question is, do you have a special session of the legislature to approve it earlier, or do you wait till next legislative session, which starts in January? And if it doesn't pass until next legislative session, it's probably fiscal year 16 when it ends on the ballot, and so it wouldn't take effect probably until fiscal year 17. And Vince raises a really good point. 5 years, it would drop down, and that's fiscal year 21, and that's the same time Prop 301 could go away. So it could be be a good idea if you were a superintendent to kind of plan your retirement. And say, hey, things were fine when I was a superintendent. I don't know whatever went on. But we get more details, and how the money would actually be distributed nobody's released that yet.
But currently, if I understand the math, currently about 25% of the total school funding is coming out of state trust land.
No, they get 2.5% of the money that's in the state trust gets distributed to schools. The only thing that goes into the regular funding formula for schools is that $72 million that comes off the top.
Okay.
And we're hoping at some point the legislature would give that up and say, let that go directly to schools, because the $72 million and it used to be all the earnings went into the legislature to help with the funding. And when it changed, it was at $72 million, so they grandfathered in this. That's why it's $72 million. It's grandfathered in for a number of years. But hopefully the legislature would at some point say, well, you can have that added to your spending rather than just part of covering the cost of basic funding.
Thank you.
Chuck, before we let you go, if I could have you address just one other issue, and that is, I'm going to ask Mark to address this as well. Part of what came out of the budget was this classrooms first idea, which is, I think the governor really trying to take money out of the administrative side of school budgets and put it into the classroom side of school budgets. And that's going to be a big conversation over the next year as this task force does its work. And I know you're advising the task force. Can you talk a little bit about that, what the realities are in terms of administrative costs and classroom costs, and where you see that going?
Right. If you look at the percentage of the budget that goes into the classroom, and the definition of the classroom is very narrow in terms of how the federal government looks at it. It's teacher aides, and supplies. In Arizona, when you look at that, it's probably about 55% of their budget goes into that, and the national average, in fact, the latest number I looked at was like about 60%, so we're below the national average. Where we're above in terms of the percentage that we spend are on student support services and instructional support. And what student support services are counselors, speech therapists, and things of that nature. This legislative session, the original proposal was to force districts to cut 5% in their non-classroom and move that money into the classroom. That would have meant food service, transportation, building operations, student support, and instructional support. As districts talk to their legislators and everything, said the first thing is the definition of being very narrow ought to be expanded a little bit, because everybody thinks that counselors are critical. Everybody thinks that speech therapists are required by law, physical therapists are required by law. So in Arizona, what they're going to do is they're going to change and add three things together. Add classroom, traditional classroom, add student support and instructional support, and that's what districts have to target. And that raises Arizona up to about 67%. But the federal one goes up too, but it doesn't go up nearly as much. I think they go to like 71 or so. And the proposal to make districts cut in their non-classroom areas and move that money into the classroom got changed. And basically what a district has to do now is when they adopt their budget, they have to put the percentage of budget money that's going to be in the classroom under that new definition. And they have to have a public meeting to tell people what they're trying to do to put more money, a larger percentage in the classroom. This new committee that's meeting, which is called Classrooms First, that's one of the things they'll probably take a look at. And it's a major issue. Ironically, one of the problems that districts have with it, like food service and transportation are, if the more you spend on food service and the more you spend on transportation, the lower percentage of dollars in the classroom, because it takes all of those expenses in the denominator. And if you're a district that has a lot of transportation in a rural area, or you have a lot of kids on free reduced lunch, you spend more. So I think there's some problems in how that gets calculated. The concept is perfect. Everybody wants to put more money into the classroom, but they need to, I think, look at it a little bit differently. And I'm not anti-charter school. I think there's some really good charter schools that are out there. But when you look at charter schools, they spend less in the classroom than traditional school districts. They're in the 52, 53, 54%. That I don't, and there's a lot of people who don't think just putting more money in the classroom makes better instruction. There's a lot of things that go into it. But that committee that the governor appointed, which they have their first meeting on June 26th, is going to look at any changes to the funding formula. But it's called Classroom First. Yes?
The district charters that have to close, can those go back to being regular district schools, or do they?
Yeah,
have to
they'll
close
go
both?
back to regular district
Okay,
schools.
so there's no effect on the
The teachers will
students in
still
those
stay there.
schools.
The principals will still stay there. Most of the kids will probably still stay there in most all cases, but they just won't. They won't get an extra $1,000 per pupil that they were getting by being a district-sponsored charter.
Well, and that represents a 16% drop, right? If the per pupil spending was $6,000 and now it's dropping down to $5,000, their budget's effectively been cut by about 15%.
But it's about $1,000. It's pretty much $1,000. But because you do the weight, that's on average. But you're right in the right general thinking or whatever. But
Okay.
the way districts, it's easier to look at about $1,000. It's $1,000 a kid,
Right.
which is easier if you got 800 kids. You can figure out how much you're 500, whatever you're going to do. But it's quite a big drop in revenue.
Okay.
I know, I think we probably kept you a little longer because I know you have to run to, I think you're
Okay.
attending the.
Okay,
press
I'll
conference.
take
You have
one
time for
more
question?
question. There were two more because two people had their hands raised. Yep, nope, right behind you.
You said charters don't spend money on food services?
No, well, they spend less on student services percentage-wise than school districts do.
And so typically it's because they're not getting the free and reduced lunch?
Or they may have different curriculum, how they structure their services or whatever. But they do get less disabled kids, so generally your student support services, you're not going to need as many or maybe no school psychologists. You may not need a physical therapist or occupational therapist. You have a question?
How is capital defined? Is it purely bricks and mortar and maintenance, or are we talking technology and additional infrastructure?
Capital is generally defined as things that you would buy that would have a useful life, like a table, a chair, a school bus,
So it's
a
capital
vehicle.
expenses, not just physical
It-
buildings?
Right, it's kind of the things that are brick and mortar or capital, hard items that you would buy, and school districts are really hurting. Now, the only ones, if you could pass a bond election and then remodel a lot of your schools with that bond money, that would help a lot. But otherwise, and what happened to the state, there was Students First was a lawsuit many years ago, and the legislature had to put certain standards and they spent $1 billion bringing all the schools up to their standards. And right now, schools don't have the money to maintain those standards. And I don't know if any of you know Tim Hogan, who's an attorney who's done a lot of law, sued the state many times and wins most times. He's thinking about bringing that lawsuit back again because he's basically saying the state is not living up to the settlement agreement to provide enough money to schools so they can keep their buildings up to minimum standards.
Are these funding rates the same for online and distance learning?
Yeah.
High school? So they get the same amount of
Now, they'll be,
funding?
well, depending on how many courses the student's taking, whether they're full-time or part-time, it's a little bit different.
So where does the classroom money go?
Well,
For the internet?
they just get the money. They can spend it any way they want. And there's a lot of issues with some districts with online programs because school districts can't get paid for summer school. Charters that run online programs can because they bring somebody in during the summer, have them take 2 classes online, and they get paid for that. So there's a lot of there's some issues with online. And then the issue with their funding is probably 95, 96, 97% of the full funding. Depends on how much time the student spends in there. And the question is that do they need, shouldn't that be a more economical way once you get your programs in place and stuff? And we've had a lot of growth over the years in some of the online programs. And I'd say one last thing is one of the other things that gripes districts a little bit is a student between a charter and a school district can only be one student. So let's take you took a class on two credits on an online class during the summer, and then you go to Saddle Mountain and you spend all year at Saddle Mountain. Saddle Mountain has to share the fund. They don't get full funding. They only get a percentage depending on the credits that the person took, but they'll have the kid in there all year long. So there's a lot of concerns about online and how they're put together. So,
Chuck, thank you so much.
thank you.